Next, what I want to talk about is a treatment for obesity. Now, there are many drugs out there that say they help reduce appetite and promote weight loss, and some of them are effective. Because in the practice of psychiatry, many of the medicines that we use tend to promote weight gain. Most psychiatrists try to help patients with that by giving or adding something that will help lose weight. And there are lots of medicines that may be helpful with that. Unfortunately, some of the better ones, typically it's hard to get insurance to pay for them, okay? But there is something natural that I've been using for quite some time, for several years now, that I've had pretty good success with. In preparation for this podcast, though, I have learned that, not all the products work the same, even though they have the same name and they report to be based on the same natural agent. And I'll talk more about that later. But for now, let's step back a little bit and review some of the things we've talked about already. So imagine somebody who's drank a nice, rich, thick, sweet milkshake, and all those calories are in their blood. And now if you take a look at a close-up of the blood, you see these sugar molecules in the blood looking for an exit, right? Like cars on a freeway looking for a place to get off. Now, there are two exits that the sugar can have from the blood. There are more than two, but for our purposes, we're simplifying it to two. The fat or the muscle, okay? In a healthy, non-obese individual, non-diabetic individual, where there is no insulin resistance, the lion's share of the sugar will exit the blood and go into the muscle and be burned as fuel or stored as glycogen, the lion's share. So when you look at graphs of blood sugar after ingesting a meal, you'll see it spike and then go down. Well, the reason it's going down, or much of that slope of going down, is because the muscle cells they're sucking up that sugar to be burned, okay, or stored as glycogen. That's why you see that steep drop. And then some of that fat, some of that sugar will go into the adipose tissue, and glucose goes to glycerol ultimately. You take the sugar, bring it into pyruvate to citrate, malonyl-CoA onto free fatty acids, and that's stored as fat molecules, okay? So those are your options, and I mentioned that last time. Now, the problem when you have active inflammation, when you are in insulin resistance, what happens is that the insulin receptor is not working very well. And it, instead of allowing sugar to pass into the muscle cells, it stands there and says, "You shall not pass." So, not a lot of sugar is going to end up in the muscle cells. I mean, it's not like the muscle cells are importing zero sugar, but the amount of sugar that gets into the muscle cell is very small compared to what they normally got, okay? Meanwhile, the fat cells are like, I mean, if you imagine the muscle cells are like, Motel 6, right? I mean, just a few rooms. Well, the fat cell is like the Hyatt Regency, huge place, lots of rooms, infinite amount of rooms that you can stay in. And yes, they have a door that's insulin modulated. They do have insulin mediated transport, but in addition to insulin-mediated transport for the sugar, so the sugar can go from the blood into the fat cells. There's also non-active transport. There are other doors that will allow the sugar to enter the fat cells. So when the fat cell needs someplace to go, needs an exit, the Ritz-Carlton, the fat cell, is open for business to take all of the stragglers. So all the sugar can go into the fat cell. Yahoo! So they enter the fat cell. Now, and as they go in, the sugar is turned into fat, and what happens to the size of the fat cells? Well, as more triglycerides are stored, the fat cell, if you imagine the fat cell like a big old water balloon, it starts to get bigger. Boom. More fatty acids, right? And boom, and boom. And the bigger the fat cell gets, the more distressed it becomes. Why? Well, you only got so much blood supply there. And by expanding the size of the cell so big, after a while, parts of the cell, or some cells, become necrotic. That means they start to die because they have outgrown their oxygen and blood supplies. And as tissue damage starts to take place because of too much size, this obesity state is a pro-inflammatory state. Cells are in distress. They're not designed to healthily grow beyond a certain size. And so what happens is you end up with these inflammatory mediators because cells are dying. These inflammatory mediators come out like tumor necrosis factor alpha, interleukins, interferon, resistant, and other inflammatory molecules are being released into the system. And ultimately that's going to cause the inflammation builds on itself. You end up with a positive feedback loop. Inflammation breeds more inflammation. And as I mentioned earlier, when you're having an active inflammation causes a problem in that turns off the insulin receptor. So that poor muscle cell that is not going to be able to get, that's the mechanism of insulin resistance. That poor muscle cell, it needs sugar, it needs glucose, but the insulin receptor has been turned off by inflammation, and so very little sugar is going to make it into the muscle cell, and plenty of it is going to go to the fat cell. Now, just wanted to set that up for you because there is a fruit that produces a neat little molecule. Okay, it's called hydroxycitric acid, and in one form it's called supercitramax. And what hydroxycitrate does, or what hydroxycitric acid does, is it blocks the conversion of sugar into fat. Now I'm going to spend quite a while here explaining how that happens. Now this fruit, in India they call it karempuli. Okay, it grows in Indonesia, Southeast Asia, India, and Africa, and it's also called the Malamar tamarind. It's the common name now, thanks mostly to Dr. Oz. The name that it goes by is Garcinia Cambogia. Garcinia Cambogia. Okay. Now, there are many phytochemicals in this very useful plant. For one thing, the plant has a very thick rind. I mean, very thick. I mean, the fruit itself, it's a citrus fruit, kind of like a lemon in the center, but it has this very, very thick rind. And in the rind of the fruit, you find lots of useful chemicals, like citric acid, but also, most importantly, a lot of hydroxycitric acid. So there are tons of other organic acids in it, but the one of most interest to us is hydroxycitric acid. We're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about that. Now, much of what I'm going to be saying today is based on an article you can pull up online. It was published in Evidence-Based Complementary and Alternative Medicine in 2013, and a lot of what I'm going to say today is based on that review article. What they do is they summarize a number of clinical studies, both animal studies as well as human studies, on the efficacy of Garcinia for its anti-obesity effects, for its weight loss effects. And so I'm going to kind of be summarizing a lot of that in today's podcast. So according to the article, there are 4 mechanisms by which Garcinia appears to promote weight loss. Number 1 is it increases serotonin availability in the brain. So by regulating serotonin, as you may have heard from me in another podcast, serotonin is the neurotransmitter not of pleasure or happiness, but well-being. It makes you less restless. Okay, it promotes contentment. Okay, so it increases serotonin levels. In addition, it decreases lipogenesis. It reduces the rate at which your fat cells make new fat cells. It increases fat oxidation. What does that mean? It helps you burn fat. It promotes the burning of fat, and I'll go into the precise mechanism by which that is done a little bit later on. And interestingly, it downregulates a spectrum of obesity-related genes. See, we have all these genes in our bodies, but not all those genes are active all the time. And there are some genes that when they're active, they promote fatness, they promote obesity, and others promote thinness. Well, use of Garcinia literally promotes genes that support thinness and are anti-obesity. So anyway, I'll probably spend the least amount of time on that because I really want to focus on the things that are easier to conceptualize for a regular audience. All right, now, you've heard the term supercitramax. If you've been to my office, I've probably called it supercitramax. In fact, for years, by the way, I've been recommending this before Dr. Oz. For the record, I have. I was way before Dr. Oz. Okay, but when he got a hold of it, he popularized it, and he called it by its fruit name. So he calls it by the Latin name, Garcinia Cambogia. And so now, when it's marketed, he did a great job of making it popular, I have to say that. When it's marketed, everybody's calling it Garcinia Cambogia, which is the name of the fruit itself. But the active ingredient, the thing that's doing most of the work, is the hydroxycitric acid. Now, in the hydroxycitric acid form, it has a minus charge. That is not terribly stable, and when you take Garcinia fresh, when you take the extract or you take the ground up rind fresh, you're going to get plenty of that hydroxycitric acid, and that is great for blocking that enzyme that turns sugar into fat. But as it sits around, as it gets old, it seeks a more stable form, and so it tends to form a lactone ring, and I'm going to talk a lot about that a little bit later on. But if you take the anions, take anions like magnesium or calcium or sodium, you take a salt, you take an anion and you attach it to the hydroxycitric acid, you can make it more stable, so it's less likely to go into its lactone form, and that's called Super-Citramax. Not every product, I'm not convinced that every product, this is not FDA regulated, so I'm not convinced that every product that calls itself Super-Citramax is actually Super-Citramax. Okay, some of that is just ground up Garcinia rind, and they haven't done any, because it's a chemical process. Okay, it's a specific chemical process that's necessary in order to attach the magnesium or the calcium to the molecule. And I'm not sure that everybody has done that, and so they're kind of using the terms Garcinia and Super-Citramax interchangeably, when really Citramax or Super-Citramax, it's supposed to be the when you combine it with the magnesium salt or the calcium salt or the potassium salt. Anyway, next. There are thousands, well, I mean, maybe hundreds, I'm not sure. I didn't count them all, but there are many brands of weight loss products that say that they have Garcinia in them, where they feature Garcinia Cambogia, and they come in a variety of prices. And unfortunately, not all of them are equally effective. Some of these just don't seem to work. Some of these have been sitting on the shelf for a very long time, and again, the longer they sit on the shelf, the more they can go into the lactone form, unless they've chemically modified it to make true Super-Citramax. All right. Now, it works by its effect on an enzyme called ATP citrate lyase. ATP citrate lyase, as I said in the last podcast, takes, it's glucose, is the sugar from your diet. Glucose gets converted into citrate, and then citrate meets up with ATP citrate lyase, and that enzyme says, hey, citrate, how would you like to live forever? How would you like to live in the land of Love Handle, for example? And I'll make you fat. And that's what happens. Citrate goes to ATP citrate lyase and ends up incorporated into a bunch of fat cells. That's how it works. All right, there's the chemical reaction. Now, hydroxycitrate. This is what we're talking about. That's the active ingredient in Garcinia Cambogia. Hydroxycitric acid, or Super-Citramax. What it does is that it has an extra OH group. Here you see a picture of it, and notice the blue OH group. Okay, that's an extra hydroxyl, and that changes the molecule. So everything else, everything in black, is regular citric acid. When that blue OH group is added, it turns into hydroxycitric acid. Now here's the deal. Regular citric acid binds to the ATP citrate lyase with a certain affinity. Think about the word affinity like glue. Like if you take and you were together, say you were to glue a piece of paper together. Okay, now you can use a weak glue like flour and water, okay, and that would cause them to stick to one another, so the strength of the bond would be the affinity. Or you could use Gorilla Glue, okay, in which case that's a much stronger affinity. Now, the difference between citric acid or citrate and hydroxycitric acid is 100 times. Hydroxycitric acid binds to the enzyme 100 times stronger than citric acid does. So that hydroxycitrate is like, what it's going to do is going to inactivate. It's going to bind so strong, it's going to take those enzymes out of commission for a long time. So they won't be able to turn your sugar into fat. All right? It is a potent competitive inhibitor of ATP citrate lyase. So picture it like this. Imagine the lizard here, that's your enzyme, that's your ATP citrate lyase, and it loves citrate. It has a mouth perfectly fit to the citrate molecule, which is our bugbear. So it reaches out, it grabs the citrate goes inside the enzyme, and the enzyme does its thing. It alters the citrate molecule, so out the other end comes what? That's right, acetyl-CoA. Okay, and acetyl-CoA is the molecule, that's the first step in making lipids. That's the first step in making fatty acids, okay, acetyl-CoA. Now, instead of citrate being available, if hydroxycitrate is there because you took some Garcinia half an hour before you ate, all right, if hydroxycitrate is present, it binds to the mouth of that enzyme 100 times stronger, and it stays bound. It's like it glued the mouth of the lizard shut. So it can't, it's not, now that enzyme is not available to bind citrate. So even though you might be eating rice and potatoes, that sugar cannot be turned into fat because you blocked the first step because of the hydroxycitrate. Okay? So again, instead of sugar or paste, instead of like flour and water paste holding things in the mouth of the enzyme, you've got super glue or gorilla glue holding it in there, and now the enzyme is not available to work on citrate. So even if you eat sugar, that sugar is going to go back into the blood. Instead of being bound up in the fat cells, it's available to go back into the blood, and it keeps your blood sugar from dropping. Okay, because what would make your blood sugar drop after a meal here would be the fat cells sucking up all the sugar and then turning it into fat, and then it wouldn't come back. I mean, once it gets turned into fat, it's gone. I mean, it's never to be resurrected unless some supernatural things happen, like you exercise. Okay, but if you block that first step, the fat cell has to give the sugar back to the blood, and your blood sugar won't drop. And if the blood sugar doesn't drop, you're not going to be so hungry, because low blood sugar causes hunger, and it also gives you pleasure from eating. Okay, so here you see the pathway here. As you see, citrate lyase is blocked, and that citrate has to go back out into the blood and get burned in energy. So ultimately, hopefully, it makes it to the muscle cell, and everybody happy, and they lived happily ever after. All right. Now, it's mentioned in this article that the supercitramax, or hydroxycitric acid, it increases energy expenditure. Now, how does that happen? I mean, now from what I've just described to you, you can probably understand why it would prevent the fat cell from turning sugar into fat. But how does that help you mobilize the fat that's already in your white adipose tissue? How does it help you burn that fat? Because sometimes it's hard to lose weight. Now, a lot of people have had this experience where you start on an exercise program or a diet, and your weight drops 3 or 4 pounds, and then it stays there. I mean, no matter what you're doing, you're starving yourself, and your weight won't go any further. Your body doesn't want to give up any more weight. Well, what's doing that? Well, I'm going to talk about that. Okay, this molecule, according to this article, they're saying that it enhances the rate at which you burn calories. I'm going to talk about that. All right. Now, here we see the mechanisms that we've described so far. It reduces appetite by raising serotonin levels. That's what they're saying here. And it blocks fat by blocking that ATP citrate lyase, as we described earlier. Now, notice this pathway here. Now, I don't know how much biochemistry you've had, but if you've had any, you can follow along with this. Acetyl-CoA becomes malonyl-CoA, and then malonyl-CoA gets, you keep adding 2 carbon units, and you're making fatty acids, right? Well, that second step, that acetyl-CoA to malonyl-CoA. Malonyl-CoA is very important. The more sugar that's being turned into fat, the higher the malonyl-CoA in your system, the higher the malonyl-CoA in your blood. Okay, malonyl-CoA, that has very important features, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. First, I'm going to give you this question: what do you think is worse, 1,000 calories of butter or 1,000 calories of potato or rice? Okay, I'll give you a minute. Now, okay, minute's up. When I was in school, when I was in undergrad, graduate school, and even medical school, we considered them the same. 1,000 calories of butter, 1,000 calories of rice, it didn't make any difference. 1,000 calories is 1,000 calories. It's equal. Now we know better. We've learned more about the biochemistry of sugars, and that's not true at all. What's worse is the potato, the rice, the carbohydrate. Carbohydrates make it more difficult to lose weight than fats. So if you were to, it matters, okay? Now, hang on to that. Imagine the fat cell like a big old water balloon full of grease, right? How do you get that grease out of the balloon and out there into the blood or into the mitochondria you get the fat from inside into the mitochondria. The mitochondria are like the furnaces of the cell. That's where things get burned. And you want to get the fatty acids that are stored in the white adipose tissue, the fat. You want to get that from the cell into the mitochondria, okay, into the matrix of that mitochondria. It doesn't go there naturally. It just won't. It has to be transported into the mitochondria. And the molecule that will do it is a molecule called carnitine. Now, carnitine, think of carnitine means meat, as you probably know. I don't want you to think of it that way, though. Think of the word carnitine like carnitine, because a car is necessary to transport the fatty acid from the cell into the mitochondria. It needs a car. It needs to be escorted by a car, like a Ford Escort, maybe. I don't know, okay? So carnitine is necessary to escort fatty acids from the cell into the mitochondria. You got to have that. Carnitine is necessary. Now, in order for carnitine to do its work, it needs an enzyme, carnitine acyltransferase. Carnitine acyltransferase. As this enzyme gets busy, and it takes the carnitine, and it connects it to a fatty acid, now that can cross into the mitochondria and be burned as fuel. That's necessary. So if carnitine acyltransferase is active and you got carnitine going on, then the carnitine will hook up with a fatty acid, and it will go into the furnace and be burned. Everybody's happy, yay. Now, if you're eating, here's a picture of instead of a car, I've got a bicycle here, but imagine those bricks are fatty acids, and the bricks need to be transported into club mitochondria, where everybody gets to be turned into energy. So we need that. Carnitine transferase moves those bricks from out there in globland into the mitochondria, where the fires can rain down and make use of that fatty acid, making energy, as opposed to, I don't know, rolls and love handles and things like that. Now, if you're eating sugar, if you decided you'd rather have the 1,000 calories of potatoes or 1,000 calories of rice instead of the butter, okay, what happens is in order for the fat to keep that carbohydrate, it's got to turn glucose, which is the building blocks of that potato. It turns glucose into fatty acid. And remember that pathway. You need that ATP citrate lyase to turn acetyl-CoA into, to turn glucose into acetyl-CoA, and then you need to make acetyl-CoA into malonyl-CoA, and so forth. As malonyl-CoA builds up, though, malonyl-CoA stops the enzyme carnitine acyltransferase. Now think for a minute. Remember carnitine acyltransferase? That was the enzyme that hooked to carnitine. That was your car that was making the fatty acid go into the mitochondria and get burned. So if malonyl-CoA is high, then it blocks carnitine acyltransferase. So it literally prevents you from burning fat. So if you're running, trying to burn calories, and at the same time you're munching on a stick of butter, you can still burn fat. You can still burn fat calories while munching on a stick of butter. Okay? You can do that. But if you're running and you're munching on a potato, because that potato is being turned into fat, and therefore you're making a bunch of malonyl-CoA, you have turned off lipid breakdown. You have turned off oxidation of fatty acids. Okay? So, lipid calories make it easier to lose weight than sugar calories because of that. Now, let's think about, there we go. Malonyl-CoA blocks carnitine acyltransferase. So, one way to stop that process is to greatly restrict your carbs, cut down on carbs, and that's a good diet. A diet that's low in carbs is probably going to be very effective at helping you lose weight. Now, if you combine that diet with, a product like Garcinia Cambogia, okay? If you take your Garcinia, take your hydroxycitric acid, half an hour to an hour before that carb-rich meal, and you block that ATP citrate lyase by preventing acetyl-CoA, you therefore drop the production of malonyl-CoA. And if malonyl-CoA is not elevated, then you got it. You're onto it. Okay, you're right. Then carnitine acyltransferase functions normally, and they can transport lipid into the mitochondria for burning, and so you can lose weight. So that is how supercitramax or hydroxycitric acid, Garcinia. That's how Garcinia promotes the burning of fat. Now, here's something that if you talk to somebody about this, they might look at you dubiously and say, you know what, I heard that's controversial. You know, that's controversial, and they have a point. Now, the animal studies, if you take a look at, we've been doing animal studies since the 90s on hydroxycitric acid. If you look at the animal studies, it's really encouraging because animals lost weight like crazy. I mean, their lipid profiles improved, they lost weight. I mean, they were genetically altered, so the obesity genes went down. Awesome stuff, right? And then you get to the human studies, and you're going, what happened? Why is it that only half the studies show effectiveness? We have a lot of studies out there with Garcinia that don't seem to be very effective, where people just didn't lose weight. What is going on? What is the problem? Well, number one, the dosage. This is not something that's FDA regulated, and so the dosage has been quite variable. If you look at the clinical trials, the doses range anywhere from 5 milligrams per kilogram body weight to 250 milligrams per kilogram body weight. That's a lot of variability, and all of them were called Garcinia Cambogia trials, and so that's a problem. Imagine if you have a 113 pound or 113 kilogram woman, all right? So the doses used in these in these experiments were anywhere from like 500 milligram capsule a day, which is about 500 milligrams a day, to 57 capsules a day, okay, or 28,350 milligrams, if you take a look at the range that was available. And what you'll see is that in the studies where they used larger doses of Garcinia, you're going to see more effectiveness, all right? But not always. It's not the only factor that would be variable. The other variable factor here is the preparation of the substance itself, okay? If you have a product, if the clinical trial involved a product that had been sitting around on a shelf for a few years before it was finally used, remember I said, as this hydroxycitric acid, it seeks a more stable form, and it will find that stable form over time. And it will want to form the lactone ring. I mean, that's very natural for it to go to the lactone ring over time. And a lot of product is inactivated by time. And just because of product. Now, the way around that is if you were to take the hydroxycitric acid and treat the Garcinia extract with a series of chemicals, you can then add the magnesium or the calcium or the potassium to the hydroxycitrate molecule and form supercitramax. But not all products that say supercitramax have really done that. And many of these products, when they are tested for efficacy, show that they don't work. And that's why I initially, when I started recommending that people use Citramax for weight control, I didn't care. They said, you use whatever brand, and I rescind that because not everybody lost weight for these reasons. So I don't recommend all brands now. I mean, sure, there are several that are effective. I just don't have time to go through and figure out which ones work the best. So I kind of did a cheap study where I went to Amazon and looked at the reviews for the Garcinia product. And one product that was a good price that had really high stars and a lot of reviewers was the one by Bulk Supplements, okay? And that's one of the cheaper products out there. It's like, for most of these, they keep adding stuff to it to improve the efficacy of the molecule. So you'll see Garcinia mixed with chromium products, like chromium picolinate or chromium GTF, because chromium does help the muscle cell burn calories. So there's that. And they mix it with other things as well. And then you'll find fillers being in there to keep because they expect it to sit on the shelf for a long time, so they'll add fillers to keep it in the powder form so it doesn't clump and get too hard. Well, if it's sitting on the shelf for a long time, I'm wondering if it's going to be effective, and did they really, and also what I don't know is, did they really turn it, unless I have a mass spectrometer handy, I don't know if they really converted it to true supercitramax, or if they're just giving me ground up a fruit rind. I can't tell the difference. Now with this product, with the Bulk Supplements product, on myself, I noticed that the appetite suppression was amazing. I noticed it right away. I mean, it may be that I got a great batch, and I won't know until I buy more batches that if I just lucked out and got a good one, or if they're all that fresh. But I can say my experience was so positive that I've started trials with several patients now using this brand to see if this is a consistent finding. But right now, I do recommend it. I may change it. If I find out that some of their other products are not as fresh and it's not working, then I'll change the story. But for now, I'm giving them a thumbs up. Okay. But anyway, this is important to keep in mind that in the clinical trial, some of these products just were worthless. And in fact, there are studies where they've looked at several brands, and surprisingly, many of the brands were not effective. And so that tells me that this stuff is getting old and they're not treating it like they said they were. Or they're treating it wrong. I don't know. So, real quick, before I summarize things, I just wanted to remind everybody that obesity is an inflammatory condition. Inflammation, as you know, I mean, I've seen this become so popular since I graduated from medical school years ago. We didn't know that inflammation was so huge back then. I mean, inflammation is behind a lot of cancer. It is behind certainly atherosclerosis and everything, and diseases related to these vascular problems. And a low inflammatory state is a good thing. And so in obesity, you're looking at high inflammation. And one of the problems, one of the side effects of being in this pro-inflammatory state is that it can actually cause some depression. And then the next podcast, I'll be specifically talking about the mechanism by which obesity can directly cause anxiety and depression. Okay? Now, going back to the fat cell, that's growing and growing and becomes inflamed, I want you to be aware that there are several types of inflammatory cells in the fatty tissue. Certainly you've got the adipocytes, the dendritic cells, the T cells, and the macrophages. Now in a healthy, non-obese patient, the type of macrophage, which is one of the inflammatory cells, the type of macrophage that dominates in that adipose tissue is the M2 macrophage. I got pictured here as a tank. And the M2 has anti-inflammatory properties. It's like this. Imagine that the M2, the macrophages, the immune cells, are like the police officers of the cell, the police officer of the fat tissue, okay? And so what do police officers do? They're local police. They say, okay, if there's any problem, if anybody gets out of line, you call me. If there's any trouble, any injury, you call me. I'm the police here, and I will handle it. I can do that. And I don't want any outside interference from the feds. I don't want the DEA. I don't want Homeland Security here. This is local police, and we've got it covered. And so we specifically don't want outsiders in our jurisdiction. Those are the M2 macrophages. They are anti-inflammatory. And they keep things at bay. They keep things quiet. They prevent other inflammatory cells from invading their space by releasing cytokines like interleukin 10 and interleukin 1 receptor antagonist. Okay, those substances help keep other inflammatory cells away. Now, what happens when the cell gets too big, when there's too much fat and inflammation, and so the cell starts to die and get distressed because of this extra fat? Then the M1 macrophages come in from the blood, and they're like the feds and the DEA and Homeland Security, and they say, you know what, M2, you guys, you local police, you have to defer to us now because this is out of hand. We've got a hostage situation. We've got terrorists on the move, and you local police are not equipped to handle that. We are. And so the feds and the DEA and Homeland Security come in, and they are not anti-inflammatory. They do nothing but ask for help from others. And so they release tumor necrosis factor alpha, interleukin 1 beta, interleukin 6. These are cytokines that ask for help. And so more and more and more inflammatory cells all come into the fat tissue, and it becomes pro-inflammatory, and the patient's blood is full of these pro-inflammatory mediators. Okay? So here you see a picture of this, looking at normal and what happens in obese adipose tissue. It becomes very active from an inflammatory state, and that's going to ultimately affect a person's mood, and it tends to make things worse because, again, remember I said earlier, I want you to piece this together. Remember that muscle cell. Remember that insulin receptor. Remember, when insulin is present, it opens the door so that sugar can go into your muscle cell. But remember what I said? If inflammation is high, then sugar won't do it, because the inflammation causes the insulin receptor to be inactive. Even though insulin is present, the insulin receptor cannot allow and will not allow sugar to get into the muscle cell, because that inflammation causes a serine residue to get phosphorylated, okay? And there's a specific serine kinases that are activated. And again, this is for general population, so I don't want to biochemistry to death. But I do want you to be aware that it causes, this inflammation causes a specific chemical reaction that takes place on the insulin receptor, so that the poor muscle cell now is blocked from being able to get sugar, and that makes the fat cell get bigger and bigger. And so you create a positive feedback loop. Weight gain leads to inflammation, which blocks the fat cell, which blocks the muscle cell from burning sugar, so it then promotes obesity. So obesity promotes more obesity. And that's why having an intervention like hydroxycitric acid is so important and can be so helpful. Conclusion. All right, there are a number of things that I want, a number of take-home messages that I want you to remember. It's important, number one, when you take Garcinia. Now again, what doses? The dose that I currently recommend is, okay, if you get the bulk supplements, Garcinia powder, the 60% stuff, right? Okay. If you get that, you want to take 4 capsules in the morning on an empty stomach when you get up. Now there's something called a food effect. If you eat them with a big breakfast, it's better to take on a relatively empty stomach. Relatively, you can have some other your vitamins and pills with it. That's probably okay. But when it comes to a bunch of food, this hydroxycitric acid binds to stuff, and you don't want to inactivate it. So it's best if you take it. Don't eat for about half an hour after you take the Garcinia. So you get up, you take 4 in the morning, and then a half an hour to an hour before each meal, you take 2. They're 500 milligrams each, so that'd be 1,000 milligrams. So you take 2 capsules, 1/2 hour to an hour before each meal. And for most people, that leaves you with lunch and dinner, okay? But half an hour to an hour before those meals. And in that way, it'll be available to block that ATP citrate lyase, so that your fat cells will not be getting that sugar, and your muscle cells will be more likely to get a hold of that, to be burning it as energy, and you can start burning fat as opposed to just making new fat, okay? Also, you need to be aware that most people do not lose weight in the first couple weeks. That sugar that was going into your fat is now getting into your muscles, and people who have a little insulin resistance, that's going to be a new thing. Your muscles aren't used to getting that much sugar, and so your muscles are going to need to restore their glycogen stores, and so that tends to balance things out. So for the first couple of weeks, although your belt, your pants might get a little loose on you, your weight will probably stay the same for the first couple of weeks, and then that's when people start to see the weight loss after that second week. All right? So, drink plenty of water with it, okay? Drink plenty of water. And if you remember what I've said, another thing, keep it in the refrigerator or the freezer. Remember, this is pure Garcinia powder. It's just fruit rind, and it's subject to oxidation. Over time, you're going to get that product going from hydroxycitric acid to lactone. The warmer the temperature, the faster that's going to occur. So keep it in the freezer, and if you do that, you're going to have less conversion into lactone, and it will stay effective longer. Okay? So if you can remember those little tidbits, I think you'll have good success with it.